validate utility will come in handy. We're here in our validate project. Let's go ahead and start with our app.js file as usual. Now, actually, the only thing to do in here this time is require UI.validate. It's really that simple. So now let's create our little scenario. Now, I'm going to use the same example that is used on the Angular UI website, mainly because it's a good example of something that pretty much every web application will have, but that Angular doesn't natively support, and that is password confirmation. You've done it hundreds of times. It's where you type in the password twice when you're creating an account, and the passwords have to match before you can actually create the account. It just confirms that you actually know your password. Now, of course, that seems like a very common scenario, but it's not something that Angular natively has any kind of tools for. And of course, it would not be hard to roll on your own in Angular, but we're going to use Angular UI's validate utility to do this. So in here, let's create a form and we'll give it a name and we'll call it my form. And let's start with a paragraph here, and this will have an input element. Its name will be password. We don't have to give it an actual password type so that you can see what I'm typing here, although of course in a real web application, you would give this a type of password. It's important that we give it an ng model of password, and let's say that it's required as well. And now let's also add another paragraph here, and this is going to have a button, and this button will be our submit button. And let's do ng-disabled, and we will say that this button will be disabled if not my form valid. So this button will be disabled if my form $valid is not true. Now, my form, of course, is this form that we're discussing here, the form that is the parent of this button. This submit button will only be enabled if the form is valid. The ng disabled attribute here will change the disabled attribute on this button based on the value of my form. And right now we can actually see this first feature in action. If I come here, and as you can see right now, submit is disabled. However, if I enable it, you can see that I'm able to actually press the submit button. If I remove everything from that text box, it becomes disabled. So now what we want to do is add a second field here. And when these fields are equal, the submit button will be disabled. But if they do not match, then submit will continue to stay disabled. So let's create another paragraph here. And in here we have our new input, and this will have a name of confirm password. And of course, we'll give it an ng model of the same value, confirm password. We will say that this too is required. And that's all for the default values that you're used to. But we need to add some other ones. And before I do that, I'm going to put this on multiple lines just to make it a little easier to read. We need to add two other values. The first one is UI-validate. Now, this directive is similar to our ng-click directive or any of our other event handling directives. This takes either a JavaScript string or a reference to a function that's in our controller here that will be run to actually validate this field. And of course, if it returns true, the field is validated. And if it returns false, the field is considered invalid. Now, what we would want to do in this is say a $value, which is of course the value that was put into this input, triple equals, and we'll say password in this case. Password, of course, refers to this controller's model password, which is the value of our first input here. When do we want this validation to be run? Well, we can do that with UI validate-watch. And this will watch another field and validate this field whenever that one changes. So we do have to put this in quotes because it is expecting a JavaScript value. So it's our string within a string. And of course, this is the name of the field we're watching, which is our password model up here. Now, of course, we'll be able to see when these fields are invalid based on this field right here. However, we can also see this in a little more detail if we add some styling here. And let's add a style for the .ng-invalid class and the .ng-dirty class. And we'll just give it a border of 1 pixel solid red. And let's just make sure this is only for input elements because the form will get these classes too. This border will only show up on elements that are both invalid and dirty, meaning they have been changed. So if the input element is invalid because it has not been typed in yet, it will not get this. Let's come back to the browser here, refresh the page. You can see that off the top, both of these are considered valid. However, I can start typing in this one. And if I backspace all the way, you can see that it gets the red border because it's now both invalid and dirty. Now, if I start typing in here, notice that as soon as I start typing, the submit button becomes available. That means there's a problem. Let me open up our console, and we don't have any errors off the top. So let's come back to our code here, and okay, I can see where the error is here. The problem is I've just put this code here right in like that, but this actually is expecting a string. So I have to put value equals password inside quotes as well as the watch here. So, all right, so now that that's in quotes, we can refresh this and let's try this again. So I'll say we got our password there. Now, if I start typing here, okay, notice two things. First of all, submit button is still disabled because this does not match that. Second, notice that there's a red box around our confirm field here because this is now both dirty because we have started to type in it, and it's invalid because it does not match ASDF. And that is the UI validation directives in action here. Our validation code here, value equals password, is being run. And since this isn't valid, the directive is marking it as such. So I can do SD, still invalid. Notice as soon as I type the F, that is no longer red, and the submit button is now enabled. Now, like I said, if you need to do a more complex validation than what we've done here, you don't just have to stick it in the validate here. For example, let's create a function here that would do that. So we can say scope, and we'll just say .validate password, and this will be a function. Let's take a value here as a parameter, and we'll say value triple equals $scope.password, right? So now in here, what we can do is say validate password and pass it the value that we can get from this. If I refresh this, and now you can see it's working the same as it did before. If I continue typing, it's now red and the button is disabled. And there you go. So you can see we can both perform the validation in line, or we can perform the validation in our controller here. But either way, the validation is being performed. Now, of course, this is only one way that you can use the validate utility, but I find it an extremely handy and quick way to perform a task that you need to do in pretty much every web application.